The majority of Americans still support the death penalty. Depending on the polls, the percentage is anywhere from 55 to 60% of Americans who support the death penalty for individuals who have committed murder. On April 29, 2014, Clayton Lockett was brought into the execution chamber. He was tied to a gurney, and a paramedic began to prepare his veins for an IV. She got a vein on the first try, but forgot the tape to hold it in place, and while somebody else went to retrieve it, the IV slipped out and the vein collapsed. This was followed by multiple and painful attempts to start an IV. Finally, they tried the femoral vein in Lockett's groin, and despite using a needle that was too short, it appeared they had gotten to the vein. After they began to administer the 3 drugs, it was supposed to render him unconscious, but it didn't. Lockett began straining against his restraints. Eventually, he tried to sit up, lifting his head off the gurney. He began to talk and said, "Oh man, something is wrong." The doctor noticed a large bulge in his groin filled with the 3 drugs that were supposed to be in his vein. They tried reinserting the needle into his other leg, but punctured an artery instead. In the doctor's opinion, there was not enough of the drugs in his system to kill him, but there was too much in his system for the doctor to do anything to keep him alive without a full hospital facility. 10 minutes later, Clayton Lockett's heart suffered a myocardial infarction. It took 45 minutes for Lockett to die, and the cause of death was not execution by lethal injection, but heart attack. There are several problems with using lethal injection, but potentially the biggest problem is that obtaining the drugs required for the executions are becoming difficult or impossible to obtain. Originally, sodium thiopental was used almost universally to cause unconsciousness. Then the sole U.S. producer shut down in 2010. First, they found a seller of these drugs in the UK. When the UK and European government passed laws banning the sale to the US because it was being used for executions, the states then went to India and used a middleman who lied to producers about why the drug was being purchased, and then smuggled the drug into the US. Eventually, in 2012, the DEA raided and seized drugs from 5 states because they were illegally smuggled. Since then, the states have gone to experimenting with different combinations. It was one of these experimental combinations that was used on Mr. Lockett. The use of midazolam was a new approach to causing unconsciousness, primarily because it was easily available. It had only been used once before, Mr. Lockett, by a prisoner in Florida. During that execution, the condemned lifted his head after the paralytic was administered and yelled out, "My whole body is on fire." It was these concerns that caused Thomas Arthur, an Alabama death row inmate, to sue the state of Alabama to demand that they execute him by firing squad instead of lethal injection. The United States Supreme Court denied his petition, but Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote a scathing dissent in it. She stated that Mr. Arthur had presented significant evidence that Alabama's current lethal injection protocol will result in intolerable and needless agony, and he has proposed an alternative, death by firing squad. She discussed how execution had progressed from hanging to electrocution to the gas chamber to lethal injection, only to abandon it and move on to a new one as science reveals that the method causes unconstitutional levels of suffering, and ended by saying that it is a cruel irony that the method that appears most humane may turn out to be our most cruel experiment yet. In addition to being near instant, death by shooting may also be comparatively painless, she wrote. Condemned prisoners like Arthur might find more dignity in an instantaneous death rather than prolonged torture on a medical gurney. In Justice Sotomayor's dissent, she cited a study which showed that 7% of the executions by lethal injection between 1890 and 2010 were botched, meaning that they departed from the standard protocol set forth by the state. The number of botched firing squad executions, meanwhile, was 0. Professor Jonathan Groner, a surgeon from Ohio State University, stated that he believes the firing squad is quicker and causes less suffering than other forms of execution. He said there's pain, certainly, but it's transient. If you're shot in the chest and your heart stops functioning, it's just seconds until you lose consciousness. Professor Deborah Deno, a law professor from Fordham University, pointed out the advantage of hiring trained marksmen as opposed to medical professionals as required by lethal injection. She said lethal injection has been hamstrung by the fact that most physicians refuse to participate in executions. This leaves prison staff to perform a series of procedures that require professional medical skill. Firing squads, on the other hand, use professional marksmen. In addition, there is little fear of a sudden shortage of material. A problem with lethal injection is that drugs used are manufactured with the purpose of being used to save lives. That places the use of drugs for execution at odds with the purpose of the companies of these drugs. Firearms and bullets have a different use altogether. While some use of firearms and ammunition do not involve their lethality, the primary purpose of these materials is still to cause death. These weapons and ammunition are marketed based upon their lethality. Therefore, the manufacturers and suppliers of these items will not have the same morale or ethical objections with their use in executions. Finally, let me tell you one last story to contrast with Mr. Lockett in 2010, Ronnie Lee Garner was executed in Utah by firing squad. At 12:15, he was placed in a metal chair surrounded by sandbags. 5 police officers who volunteered for the duty stood 25 feet away and aimed 5 .30 cal rifles at a paper target pinned to Garner's chest. The riflemen counted down and simultaneously fired their rifles. At 12:17, Mr. Garner was pronounced dead. Ronnie Garner was dead and had left the world with dignity, discussed by Justice Sotomayor. If we are going to continue to support the death penalty as a country, we should do it in the most humane and ethical way possible. At this time, lethal injection is not meeting those obligations, but execution by firing squads will. For that reason, execution by firing squads should replace lethal injection as a default method of executions in the United States. Please petition your state and federal representatives. Thank you.